Welcome. Hello, I'm Dhiraj Murthy, Professor of Media Studies in the Moody College of Communication and Director of the Computational Media Lab, both at UT Austin. I am thrilled to be hosting today's event, Disinformation Day. Our event, Disinformation Day, seeks to answer key questions around fact-checking, bias, and fairness in order to help further disinformation-related research and remove roadblocks that we may not yet even know about. This inaugural Disinformation Day event serves as a call to action around two key themes in misinformation and disinformation studies. That is, fact-checking beyond fact-checking and bias, fairness in annotation and labeled data. We are absolutely thrilled to have 6 expert panelists in a keynote from organizations and academia worldwide. We encourage you to share your thoughts and engage with this Disinformation Day through social media platforms via our event hashtag, which is hashtag DisinfoDay22. The program for our event can be accessed at disinfoday.com, and all the information about the panelists, speakers, our project and organization are available there. If you're a panelist, please keep your microphone and camera on mute and off unless it's your panel's time. I'm pleased to introduce Matt Lease, professor in the School of Information and principal investigator of our Good Systems Core research project, to kick off today's event.
Hi, Dhiraj. Thanks so much, everyone. It's a pleasure to get a chance to talk with you all today. So I will be both introducing our keynote speaker and providing some additional context about the work happening here at UT Austin. First, I'm one of the faculty founders and leaders of Good Systems, an 8-year grand challenge at the University of Texas at Austin to develop responsible AI technologies. As part of Good Systems, Dhiraj and I are leading a cross-campus project entitled Designing Responsible AI Technologies to Curb Disinformation, which brings together faculty across the Moody College of Communication, School of Information, Department of Computer Science, Department of Linguistics, and the McCombs School of Business. Our goal is twofold: to investigate the potential of responsible AI technologies to help address the great challenge of online information today, disinformation today, and to use this societal challenge as a test bed to develop responsible AI technologies that are explainable and fair. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. David Corney completed his PhD in computer science at University College London in 2001, specializing in machine learning. His career has spanned both tech startups and academia, including journalism and machine learning work at City University London, Robert Gordon University, Signal Media, and FactMata. In 2019, he joined FullFact as a data scientist specializing in natural language processing, where he has helped bring AI into FullFact workflows to better support fact checkers and other colleagues. Over his career, Dr. Corney has developed numerous tools to analyze news articles, social media, and other sources of text, as well as worked in visual neuroscience and botanical imaging. It's our great pleasure to have him here with us today. I know you're all in for a real treat. David, please take it away.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Let me first share my slides and then get going. Yeah, it's a real privilege to be here speaking to you all today. Thank you again to Matt Lease for inviting me. Just to show how quickly things move, I think when I first was invited, I think Boris Johnson was our Prime Minister. Since then we had Liz Truss, who will come later on, and now we're on our 3rd Prime Minister of the year. So it's all very exciting times here in the UK. But it's great to be talking to you there, wherever you are. So yeah, today I'm talking about how AI can help fact checkers to fight bad information. So I'm a data scientist at FullFact, which is the UK's leading independent fact checking organisation. And I'll be talking today a bit more about what fact checkers do and what FullFact does and how I work within them to help use AI more effectively. First, the motivation, the reason FullFact exists is really summarised by these 4 words. Bad information ruins lives. It can harm our communities, it can spread distrust and hatred, it can undermine democracy, and leads to bad decisions. And all of us make decisions every day based on the information we have. So it stands to reason that if we're given bad information, our decisions become less reliable. And therefore, it's really important for everyone in society that we are presented with the best information possible. I should also note here that I'm saying bad information. I'm aware that today is the Disinformation Day at Houston. And I think it's worth addressing that because my understanding that the definitions of disinformation versus misinformation, usually there's a contrast there, is that disinformation is people who deliberately create or spread information that they know to be false in order to persuade people of a point of view, such as some forms of political propaganda, for example, or fraud. Whereas misinformation is information which is wrong and misleading, but is shared in good faith. And therefore, people who genuinely believe things and share them or say them, even though they happen to be mistaken. And this is it can be a useful distinction. However, because by that definition at least, it's really defined by the state of mind of the person spreading the information. Do they believe it or not? Do they know it's true or false? And that information is usually unavailable. You don't know whether somebody's lying to you deliberately or by accident, as it were. So I think I personally prefer these sort of more general term of bad information, which covers information which is misleading and harmful, irrespective of whether the person believes it true or false. And even when it is true or false, sometimes information can be true but still damaging if it's presented, for example, without context. Perhaps I'll come back to that somewhat later on. Now I want to go through some examples of the kind of work that Full Fact does. And one of the main streams we do, most visible stream of work I guess we do, is fact checking. It's taking claims from politicians and other public sources and examining them and saying if they are misleading and potentially harmful, damaging, then we'll write a full fact check article and publicize that as at least one attempt to reduce this bad information being spread. So here's one example actually from almost 2 years ago now, when the coronavirus was, as we know, everywhere, but the vaccines were not yet available, but were starting to be talked about. And one type of vaccine was the mRNA vaccine, messenger RNA. And so a scare story spread widely onto Facebook and elsewhere, suggesting that mRNA, if you're not a scientist, it sounds a bit scary. And the story was that this would rewrite your DNA, this get embedded inside your DNA, and therefore it would change you into some kind of genetically modified being, which isn't true. And the reason this isn't just some sort of prank or joke, if people are going to be put off taking the vaccine because of reading this misinformation, that's really serious. The most recent figures I have available is that globally around 6.5 million people sadly have died of coronavirus. But the vaccines in the last couple of years have saved more than 20 million lives. So getting a vaccine is really important. And individuals may choose, they can make their own decisions about whether to get vaccinated or not. But it's important that they have the information, good information, when they make that decision. And so this kind of misinformation that we want to fight against is really important. A second, more recent example, I mentioned Liz Truss, who was the Prime Minister of the UK until I think yesterday morning. She said all of a month ago now, basically introduced this policy to try to limit the domestic household energy bill this coming winter, which is rising due to inflation and various other reasons. And so she introduced this policy which is going to cap the basically the gross price of energy, but it wouldn't put a cap on individual household prices, which is a fine but important distinction. And I've introduced a policy which then got it wrong repeatedly on TV and in newspapers. And other people copied her, what she said. And so this misinterpretation went quite widespread. And it was reported literally in hundreds of news articles and by dozens of journalists and politicians. And the reason, again, this is so dangerous is that if people see the headline and they think, okay, my bill this year will be no more than £2,500, I'll budget for that. And I know whatever is left over, I can spend on food or clothes or whatever else. And then some of those people get a shock at the end of the year if their bill is £3,000, £4,000 or more, because there's not a cap on the bills, only on the price of energy. So again, it's important to get these things right. In fact, we have a fact check published. Will be published about this, I think, tomorrow, hopefully. A third example is almost more trivial, but also interesting, I think. Again, this was a week ago. Our health secretary is no longer the health secretary, she's now somewhere else in the government. Therese Coffey was basically talking about the pay deal being offered to nurses in our National Health Service. And part of that debate in the article was quoting the rate of inflation, which when the article was published was actually 9.9%. It then later on rose to 10.1%. And so had previously been 10.1%. So in this case, the sentence there about the rate of inflation is wrong. It's out by a small amount. It's quoting previous month's figures rather than this month's figures. And a small slip that not necessarily is worth making a big fuss about, but it's the kind of thing which is worth monitoring to make sure that it doesn't get out of hand. So there's a kind of fact checks that we write. This is the tech team at Full Fact. I should stress everything I'm describing here is not purely my own work. There's a team of 8 in our technology team, the automated fact checking team, led by Andy. And we have 3 data scientists and 3 software engineers of different kinds. And also very, very fortunate to have Kate Wilkinson as our senior product manager. Kate is a former fact checker herself. She was a deputy editor at Africa Check for many years. So she really understands fact checking inside out, has now joined our team to help us develop software better. And it's great to have a sort of end user of these tools actually in the team, but helping to build it. I want to run through a very brief, very limited history of fact checking, try to explain in more context what it is that the Full Fact does, what it is we're trying to do. In some ways, fact checking goes back, I guess for as long as there have been people telling stories, and particularly journalists. One hopes that journalists and editors always check their facts. But I think the notion of this as a separate entity, as a separate process, I think it's really popularized and started by factcheck.org in 2003, so practically 20 years ago now. And the idea there was to focus on political claims made in places like presidential debates and other political debates, and checking the claims were actually true. And if they're misleading, then writing an article rebutting those false claims. And that process is still at the core of fact checking today. But 20 years later, this hasn't actually solved the problem. I hope this doesn't come as a surprise to you, but politicians are still known sometimes to say misleading things. So merely fact checking in this way hasn't actually necessarily increased the overall quality of information in the public sphere. It helps, but it's not quite enough. And so some fact checkers, including Full Fact, have been pushing the idea for a few years now that we need to do more than just check facts. And there's a notion of publish and act rather than just publish, or publish and pray, it's sometimes called in the first generation. And the idea of publish and act is, yes, to publish fact checks and to rebut misleading claims, but also to try to identify and recognize when there are patterns of misinformation. If there's some source who keeps spreading the same kind of misinformation, can we tackle that at source rather than each individual claim as it's made? So we try to identify, whether there are problems with the systems we can then address and try to push back there. So just give one example of this. In the UK, we have a government agency called the Medical and Healthcare Products Regulations Agency. And they have a website where you can report any side effects you experience after taking any medicine or any drug in the UK. It's called the Yellow Card Scheme. And it's been there for years, and it's a good way of collecting data about things which may lead into further medical research to verify that there aren't any sort of serious problems with the side effects of drugs. During the coronavirus pandemic, however, this information got misused. People kept quoting it and saying, look, there are thousands of people on the site saying that they've had headaches and pain and heart attacks and even death reported as a side effect of the vaccine. And so the MHRA was quoted as saying, these people are saying that there are these major side effects. But actually, the whole thing is self-reported. And so when we saw these misleading reports being repeatedly spread across social media in particular, we contacted the MHRA and said, are you aware your information is your good information is being misused, misrepresented, as if it was capturing a sort of scientific consensus of side effects? And basically, we worked with them, and they agreed to change the wording on the website to make it clearer that this is self-reported data, and it shouldn't be taken. You can't just add up all those side effects and say these are all true. They need to be investigated individually. So yeah, the second generation fact checking is really to take action beyond just checking claims. And by the same argument, the proposed third generation of fact checking is to do this at an internet scale. Misinformation isn't just isolated claims that we can rebut. It's not just systems within a country. But really, we have to work collaboratively. Facebook and the internet, no borders. So we need to work collaboratively, internationally, and across language boundaries, which I'll comment later on. And there are many other ways of trying to improve the state of public debate, which fact checkers and other organisations do. Things like media literacy campaigns to try to help people recognise misinformation when they see it, rather than waiting for us to come along afterwards and say, oh, that bit is wrong, this bit's right, this bit's trustworthy, this bit isn't. Trying to help people, to convince people to stop spreading bad information. and also sometimes to improve access to reliable information, to sort of come from the other direction and say, this information is reliable and good, let's put more of that out there. So over the years that Full Fact has been running, about 12 years now, we like to think we've got quite good at fact checking. We also work closely with other fact checkers in other countries. And about 6 years ago now, we set up the technology team. And as part of that process, we carried out a big survey. My colleagues carried out a survey of other fact checkers around the world, really, to ask them how they thought technology could help them address their problems. And it really boils down to 3 areas that the fact checkers identified as areas where they need help with from technology. So the first of these is try to help identify what's the most important claim to fact check each day. So fact checkers are busy people, and it takes a surprisingly long time to check one claim. Well, it's surprising to me anyway. So to check a claim, you often need to find out exactly who said the claim, what exactly they said, who the audience was, what the context was. Was it part of a larger article, part of a debate, were they answering a question or making a speech? And that context can take some time to dig down to, but can change the way you interpret the claim. You may also need to read, or find and read government reports or figures, or academic work. You may speak to experts to get their point of view to understand things better. And all that work takes, a lot of time and effort. And so fact checkers don't want to get to the end of the day and realize that they spent time investigating a claim which actually can't be checked, or isn't actually very interesting, or isn't controversial. So what's the most important thing to check each day? And then the second question they ask is, how can we increase the impact of our work? When they do this work in writing a fact check article, how can they guarantee that that article has maximum impact? How can they make sure that as many people as possible read it, and it is read and is useful and actually changes things for the better? And then the third area they want to help with is to check statistical claims in real time. There's a subset of claims which are around sort of government figures, which are often slightly more straightforward to check, but still take some time. And so there's hope that the automation can at least help verify those as being true or false relatively straightforwardly. So over the years, Full Fact has been trying to develop tools, or is continuing to develop tools to answer these 3 questions. And I'll now run through some examples of each of those. First, it's worth stressing that, or explaining rather, where these claims come from. So for Full Fact, we collect, we scrape news articles from the UK newspapers. We get transcripts from the major TV and radio news programs, especially political news programs like the Today program. We also collect some social media posts from Facebook and Twitter, really covering some political debates there. And lastly, we also analyse Hansard, which is the official record of Parliament. So parliamentary debates all recorded there. So we collect from those sources around 100,000 sentences per day, and that gets fed into our database, and that's the starting point. And then every sentence we have, we then enrich this in ways I'll now explain, and then those enriched sentences then feed into our main tools. And so this is an example of a sentence from a newspaper a couple of weeks ago now, talking about Therese Coffey, again, the former health secretary, discussing health spending. And the second sentence there in bold says, I'll read that quickly, she said that 40% of the government's day-to-day public spending goes on health and social care. I'm not actually a fact checker, but I believe that that claim is potentially misleading because it misses out part of government spending in calculating that figure. So it's something that fact checkers certainly would want to dig into and decide whether it's actually correct or not. And so the first stage of the automated process is try to take the sentence and see what information the algorithm can find in it. And so go through several steps, this pipeline. So we start off with, on the left, this claim type algorithm. This is a specially trained BERT model, which recognizes about 10 different types of claims that can be made. So in this case, it recognizes that the type is a quantity. It's a claim about a particular value. In this case, the government's day-to-day spending. Other claim types include things like predictions about the future, which normally we can't check. Personal beliefs, that again, we can't see inside someone's head and see, do you really believe that? Not a question we're interested in, really. But also, it can include things like claims about opinion polls, about the law and regulations, about correlation. And so you can see different types of claim may be more or less interesting to fact checkers to dig into. The second stage of the pipeline is the topic classifier. This is fairly sort of standard technology just to identify from a whole article what topics are there from a predefined list of around 40 topics. So in this case, it's tagged as being about health and politics. The next stage is co-reference resolution. Again, this is quite a long-standing problem in NLP. An idea is just to recognize that in a piece of text, sometimes the same real-world entity, like a person, can be referred to by different surface forms, different strings, different sequences of words, can refer to the same thing. So in these pair of sentences, the words health secretary, Dr. Therese Coffey, and she all actually refer to the same person. And particularly recognizing that she in the second sentence is Dr. Therese Coffey in the first sentence is really useful. And the reason this is useful is because in the last box there we've got the claimant. So we have a quotation detection system which identifies what the claim is and particularly who made the claim. And so combining that with the co-reference resolution, we can see that the bold claim about public spending is made by Therese Coffey, and we can now link that to a specific entity with a Wikidata ID, the Q290554. The point is that unique identifier then unlocks other information in the public about this individual. So we look up there, for example, to find out that she's in the Conservative Party, that she's a real person. You know, fictional characters are in there too, but they're tagged as being not real. This is quite a useful thing to know. Again, you don't want to waste time fact checking someone which turns out to be from a soap opera or from a novel. So you can imagine now in our database, we have maybe 100,000 claims coming in per day, all now tagged with the type and the topics and the entities and the claimants and the co-reference, resolved co-references. So come back to the three questions that fact checkers are asking for help with. First, though, is finding claims that are worth checking. And so we developed this tool, basically a search tool over those enriched claims. So just in this screen grab, you can see at the top, the search bar here says they're searching for claims of type inflation. Claims with a keyword of inflation, so anything mentioning the word inflation, of the type quantity, looking just for quantitative claims, and where the claimant belongs to the group Conservative, so that's the Conservative Party, currently the government of the country. And you see there on this particular day, a few weeks ago now, we found 6 claims, and then it's Liz Truss, Prime Minister, happens to be top of the list. The other claims were made by government politicians or spokespeople talking about inflation and making quantitative claims. So these are the kind of claims that fact checkers may want to actually then go and investigate and check. At least they can see on the screen fairly quickly what is currently being discussed in this topic. So the second area really was trying to maximize the impact of the fact check articles. Having written the articles, how can I make them really, useful? And so one aspect of this is claim matching. So after you publish a fact check article, people in public may repeat the misleading claim. They may not be aware of the claim not be aware of the fact check, or just not really care about that, and then repeating something which we already know to be false. And so the hope is that we can reach out to them and actually ask them to correct themselves with minimal effort, because we've already done all the research and writing. So instead, we can just email, for example, a politician and say, hey, you said this thing yesterday, but you already know from the day before that actually this is false. Here's the evidence. Please can you retract your statements? Please can you publish a correction or take whatever action is appropriate? And this is where it maximizes the impact. And again, going beyond just fact checking, but saying how can we actually make the information in the real world and improve the quality there of public information in public space. And basically, this works very briefly by looking at the claims, the claims that we've already checked, shown there in bold, and using a combination of a BERT model through semantic similarity and some information retrieval methods to look for similar claims, basically, and we sort of rank those and show the top few. And somebody can basically look through this list in a few minutes and skim through, 50 or 100 matches and decide which ones are actually worth taking action on. And it doesn't matter, therefore, if a few of these are wrong. The human expert will take action where appropriate. And the third area that they asked for help with is in checking statistical claims where appropriate. And this is actually, this slide actually shows a tool we developed which incorporates this among other things. So on the left-hand side, you can see that the text This is an automatically generated transcript of a radio news program, the BBC's flagship Today program. This transcript is generated by the Google speech-to-text API. And if I read it, you'll see lots and lots of mistakes in there, things that make very little sense. Like the second paragraph starts off, the mistress is facing a test of a full tank, which confused me to realize that the mistress actually in this context is a mistranslation of Liz Truss, i.e. the Prime Minister, is facing a test. Nonetheless, even though the text is quite noisy, the algorithms can still pick out at least some information from that. And in the first paragraph they're highlighted, includes the line, inflation is above 10% again, with prices rising at a faster pace for 40 years. And the algorithm can spot that and say, okay, this is telling me about inflation. And it automatically then produces a graph, you can see on the right-hand side there, showing inflation in recent years. And the users can click through the different measures of inflation, CPI, CPIH, and RPI. And they can see at a glance, what the rate is. Is it above 10%? Is it rising? Is it falling? And so on. And basically, the information is already there and publicly available. But it would take the fact checkers several minutes to go off and check that. I'll get the right data, the right government website, and do the right search, and then you get that same figures. But by the time they've done that, they'll miss the next 5 minutes of the news program. So in this way, they can sort of see at a glance, that's fine, doesn't need checking, and carry on listening to what's actually being said live. It's also worth noting that something which surprised me is that the fact checkers find that this transcript itself, even though it's a bit noisy, very useful, because it's much easier to copy and paste a bit of text from the screen and paste it into a shared document, for example, to discuss with other fact checkers, rather than trying to say, well, did you hear that bit at 8:02 when the person said this thing out loud? And then try to get an audio recording of that snippet. It's much more effort, basically. So text is much more straightforward to deal with for humans as well as for computers. So those are some of the tools that we've been developing now for the last few years, and are still being developed. As I hinted earlier, there's a kind of issue around crossing borders and crossing linguistic borders. Full Fact is based in the UK, and we only work in English. And so all the tools we developed the last few years have been working only in English. But earlier this year, we were fortunate to win a large grant from google.org, who recognized the work they previously funded, some of this research. And they basically are now supporting us to extend this work to work in extend these tools to work in other languages. So over the next couple of years, we'll be redeveloping these tools to work in multiple languages around the world. As you may be aware, for sort of historic reasons, a lot of NLP work, a lot of natural language processing work is done in English. This goes back at least to the Cold War and sort of American academics trying to understand Russian radio intercepts and translate those into English. So trying to work out, can you do automatic translations and transcriptions of things, which turns out to be very hard. It's been recently solved, but 50 years ago, 70 years ago, that was a big challenge. And just a lot of work has been done in many American universities and UK universities in English. And so all the resources therefore developed in English, all the corpora and all the basic libraries and things, which means that anybody starting out to research NLP, it's very easy then to stick to working in English. So that's where all the resources are. So it becomes sort of self-perpetuating. Having said that, in the last few years, there have been great progress with large language models. I've already mentioned BERT a few times, but Bloom and some of the other ones now have multilingual variations. So I think one of the original BERT models was trained on over 100 languages from the outset. And Bloom has about 45, I think, languages, including many minority languages from sub-Saharan Africa and from the Indian subcontinent. So it covers a much wider range of languages than just English or just a few European languages. And so our plans, this is very much future work, but starting quite soon. My understanding is that these models can be fine-tuned to solve individual tasks in one language, and they get better solving that same task in other languages, kind of for free, because the inner parameters of the model, the inner workings of these models, are essentially language independent. So we're solving the problem in one language, so the input and output may be in English, but inner working is language independent. And so if you then give the same model input, say in Spanish or Arabic or Chinese, the output should still be fairly accurate for that particular task. So for us, tasks are things like claim type detection or semantic similarity for the claim matching. So the hope is that with possibly no data set or possibly a small data set in a target language, we can nonetheless carry out some of the same tasks. A method known as zero shot, i.e. no data, cross-lingual, so changing languages, and transfer learning, so transferring a skill from one target to another target. And yeah, the goal is really of starting next year to make this tool available, the tools we've been describing, to make this available to fact checkers globally, independently of whether they have the resources to do this. And again, it's google.org underwriting this work to help it get started, which is great. So I want to sort of end this part of the talk really by discussing some things that we've learned as a team over the last few years, what went well and what went badly. And one thing we learned, so I'm going to discuss this more later on, I think, but just briefly for now, the search tool I described earlier is useful, but it's not used as much as we thought it was going to be used. We thought this could be a great breakthrough. Actually, it turns out it doesn't really answer the question, which is what should we check today? We're not the same as show me every claim we could check today and let me search over them. Because fact checkers basically want to, when they were showing the tool, the question still was, well, what claims should I be checking? In other words, what query should I do? What query should I type in? And that's not obvious to them. So we're now developing a more opinionated tool that can give suggestions of claims to check rather than just searching over existing claims. The claim matching tool I showed you finds repeats of claims. And when I first developed it and first did the evaluation of this model, I was quite disappointed to realize that, first of all, we couldn't even measure the recall, because that would require knowing the correct labels on every article in every newspaper in a day or a week's worth of data. Basically, that's too much data to annotate. So we can't really measure the recall. What we can measure is the precision, how many of the predicted matches are actually correct. And that turns out to be, it varies, but around 5%, maybe 10%. And when I was an academic, the idea of publishing a paper saying we've got 5% recall precision and we don't know what the recall is, I don't think that would have been published in many places. But it turns out this is fine, because the users using that tool can look at the incorrect claims and dismiss them very quickly. There's no effort really false match. But to find the true matches is so valuable that it's worth their spending 5 to 10 minutes reading through the page to find those 2 or 3 good matches each day, which they can then take actions on. And turning to the statistical claim tool, again, the original hope was that we would find misleading claims that could lead to fact check articles. We thought perhaps could be automate part of the fact checking process. Turns out that, again, actually having developed the tool, that most people, when they talk about inflation or unemployment or or GDP, mostly they get the figures right. Sometimes they'll quote last month's figures by mistake, or they'll round things incorrectly, but most of the time they get them right, because it's not hard to get it right. And there's usually not much advantage in just misquoting official figures. So we're very quickly found out. But it turns out that finding claims that are true in this context is also useful. It saves the fact checker the time of going off and searching the right databases. And even though it only saves them 5 to 10 minutes a day, that still adds up. It means they can spend more time doing what they can do and the algorithms can't do, which is the full fact check articles. And really, in every case, the bottom line is, if you remember one thing from this talk, is this, which is speak to users at every stage. I'm fortunate to work within a fact checking organization and have a colleague who is a former fact checker and now turned product owner. But even so, it's still easy to make mistakes and misunderstand what's being discussed. And simple things like showing people a mock-up of an interface before you develop it means they can often say, well, hang on, that's not really what we want to use. Can you do it? Can you use can you develop this interface instead, or have this data instead? And then that kind of information as early as possible in the process really does save a lot of time. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening. I'd like to carry on this conversation. I mean, immediately now, yes, there's a Q&A with Matt, and I'll be speaking on the panel later on. But if you have any questions or comments, my email address is there. Please do keep in touch. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David. I'm sorry we don't have an auditorium cheering, but I'm sure we have it in the virtual space right now. So yeah, thank you so much for a great talk. So we do want to open this up for questions from the audience. So I'd like to invite everyone to use the Q&A feature in Zoom to post questions, as well as to upvote other questions you want answered. We may not be able to respond to all the questions we get, but by upvoting will help us identify the most popular ones. And I think we have about 20 minutes right here. And certainly I have a lot of questions, and I'll get started there and then turn to some of the other ones from the audience as we get going. David, one of the things you and I have seen, I think, many times is NLP researchers doing a lot of work in this space. and sometimes asking questions about, of all the things they're doing, what's most important and what's most helpful to actually support fact checkers in their work today. So you mentioned the survey you guys had done a couple of years ago about some of the key things that you saw then. You talked about some of the 3 problems today. So if you had a chance to take this podium and speak to the NLP research community, what are the things that you would most likely see them work on to help improve the state of fact checking in the world?
I think it's a big ask. I think one thing you need to bear in mind is trying to get a whole system working together. There's a tendency for researchers, again, I'm speaking as a researcher myself, there's a tendency to sort of split a problem down and trying to work on individual problems. Can you do, semantic similarity? Can you do, part of speech tagging? And for us, when you put the whole thing together, you put in there a noisy radio transcript which has a few errors in it. Is other tools robust enough to deal with that? Is the output going to be formatted in a useful way for the users to be able to search and use the information correctly? And often those kind of problems don't become apparent until you actually do create a complete tool and present it to users and show them what they can do. And then all the individual problems then suddenly become apparent. And so this is perhaps a bit of a pipe dream, but trying to identify how whole systems will work rather than focusing on individual problems within the systems will be my request, my prayer.
Wonderful. So one of our first questions, somebody wanted just to know is the data available from API or direct download from FullFact?
Mostly, unfortunately, not. The fact checks themselves are available. We do, well, they're on our website and they're freely available. And there's also, if you want to get them programmatically, Google provides a tool called the Google Fact Check Explorer, which lets you download fact checks from around the world, not just FullFact, through an API. Things like our training data, though, we tend not to publish that for a variety of reasons, partly because we are concerned about the possibility of bad faith use. Once you publish data and say, hey, here's how we trained our model, there's always a chance of someone creating an adversarial model, which will create false information that we can't find, and then flooding Facebook or elsewhere with that. So we don't tend to publish data. Someone's working closely with academics, we can publish some with a license. And if you're interested in that, please do get in touch.
Great. You mentioned both in your abstract and in your talk today, sort of the need to get sort of responsive information out in terms of fact checks. I think what we've heard is that if you don't get these fact checks out fast enough, at some point it becomes sort of too late, or the kind of impact they'll have in correcting things is sort of too late. And you focus specifically on statistical checks in your talk, although your abstract was sort of talking more generally about this. I would guess the statistical ones are maybe a little easier to do quickly. But maybe how are you thinking about trying to be more responsive or lower latency into responding to claims beyond statistical claims?
That's a good question. Statistical claims are usually not just faster to check, but also faster to scope. So the process of deciding how long will this take to check is actually in itself quite a hard thing to do. And as if someone wants to work out how to predict how long it will take to check a claim, that I think would be very useful information. But I think that on a good day with a sort of average straightforward claim, it takes about a day to fact check a claim from beginning to end. And so picking claims which are more straightforward to check is obviously very tempting and powerful. Possibilities that we're sort of considering is things like finding evidence automatically. So beyond simple stats, but can link people to the right reports, to the right experts, and say, here is the information you need to actually do the fact check article yourself. It's kind of tempting. It's very hard. I've got enormous respect for fact checkers who are highly skilled journalists, and they spend a lot of time, using their journalistic skills to track down information, and it is hard to work out how to speed up that process. I think one of the best things to do is just to try to reduce the time they spend checking claims which turn out to be untrackable, and therefore presenting them some kind of evidence to start with and saying, this one looks promising, this one is dead end because this word isn't defined, or because this report isn't available, this data isn't being published for years, which is then a different kind of problem.
Yeah, so just relatedly building on this, it's sort of, I think journalists and fact checkers take that highest priority on making sure every information is as accurate as possible, trustworthy, responsible. And of course, having that level of rigor takes more time, just like, for instance, when NASA, when they were sending space shuttles up and wanted to make sure that they went well, they put a lot of time into sort of making sure there weren't any problems.
Yeah.
Is there any space for thinking about some bit of fact chain of claims that are either some degree of less potentially harmful or potentially easier, where there could be more of a role for either automated or inexpert fact checking to sort of complement or support the role of the professional fact checkers on these sort of most vital, most difficult claims?
That's a good question. I think, yeah, well, you mentioned sort of NASA, and I think full fact isn't NASA, obviously. For us, it's not so much, obviously NASA's worried about rockets not blowing up. For us, it's more our reputation, that we want people to be able to trust what we say. They want to know that if they read an article, we have presented all the facts to the reader and they can make their own mind up. We're not being biased, we're not being selective in our presentation. And to maintain that reputation, we need to make sure that what we say, we can back it up. We need to say, here is the evidence, here are the reports. And that needs to be verified, and that's what takes time. So yes, I think there is scope for some kind of automation, but I think there's a reputational risk for any fact-checking organization to do that. And so yes, one possibility I'd like to sort of explore is having a sort of arm's length, a separate organization or a sort of branding for a automated tool, which can do some kind of fact-checking automatically. The idea of using sort of non-expert fact-checkers, perhaps as a sort of crowdsourced source of evaluation, it's a big challenge. I think it sounds great and it's been tried a few times, and I'm sure we'll be tried again, and maybe somebody will make it work. I think methods like Wiki News that Jimmy Wells launched a few years ago now, which I think then folded. The idea there was to get a reliable, neutral point of view news source, so breaking news being reliably covered without any political bias by people who you could trust, like Wikipedia is edited by people you trust. But it very quickly becomes mired in sort of controversy and debate about, you know, what is neutral, what is politically balanced. That in itself is a skill that journalists, you know, develop over the years. And so I think while it's appealing, and I say people will and should keep trying it, I've yet to see a really successful example of non-experts producing fact checks that other people can trust. And having said that, informally, we all do fact checking all the time. We're all in conversations with friends. We're always saying, "Oh no, actually, it was this, not that. It didn't rain yesterday." And we trust each other most of the time to do that. So I think that there are scopes within conversations within existing social groups for informal fact checking, and that perhaps can be supported more carefully through tooling, which is an interesting challenge for us.
Maybe some form even of this is a draft provisional fact check out here that, you know, clearly comes from a smiley facing robot or something before, you know, we know that the real trusted people have gotten to it or something.
Yeah. This one looks a bit questionable. Not quite sure yet.
So speaking of bias, somebody asked, you know, how do fact checkers, full fact or otherwise, you know, minimize their own bias, preference, political viewpoint, or an opinion when selecting which claims to fact check?
Yeah, very good question again. There's a couple of ways. One is full fact, where there's very, very strong rule, which is a bit weird, which is we never discuss politics or anything like fact checking, in fact, with other colleagues. And the reason it's weird is because it means that most of us at full fact are interested in current affairs and politics. And so we watch the news closely. And recently again in the UK, there's been some very big stories, 3 prime ministers and death of a monarch. And we sometimes gather around TV set and watch these things and make no comment on them at all. Nobody says, "Oh, good, that person's won or lost," or whatever, because that conversation, even if it's done informally within the office, within friends, between friends, it might still lead to bias when we actually come to then choose who we do check. Because if we know everyone in the office is actually supporting one particular politician or one particular party, we may then subconsciously become less likely to check what they're actually saying and more likely to check their opponents. So that's a very strong rule we have. I think, again, most fact-checking organizations have a similar rule of just don't discuss politics in the office or even in the pub after the office. And the second thing is to, I mentioned earlier, the sort of rigorous process. When it comes to political fact-checking, which is a core part of our work, it goes through at least, I think, 3 fact-checkers will decide before anything gets published. And that does include the editor. His job is to make sure that we are being unbiased. And this is particularly important in the run-up to elections. So there's a feeling there that we have a sort of rough policy of working out which parties are most likely to form the next government. and spend most of the time fact checking those in equal amount. And parties that are only ever likely to be a minority, we spend less time fact checking them. Not because they're not serious or committed, just because they're not likely to become the next government, and therefore it's not quite worth their effort to spend as much time checking them. So yeah, we are consciously aware of that and do continuously monitor our own output to make sure we're not biased.
Maybe to sort of touch on this in a related way, I think you've mentioned one of the things that fact checkers want the most help with is identifying what's most important. So that comes back to the criteria. What does it mean when we say important, right? What does that come down to? What factors into that? And of course, that's the place where bias could creep in as well, but they're probably institutional practices of criteria.
Yeah, the question of what is important is central and is very hard to pin down. I think you can ask any journalist, how do you decide what stories to write about? What stories go on the front page? Oh, the most important ones, of course. But what is important? Sometimes it's really obvious. If there's a major tragedy or risk of tragedy, if there is, loss of life, then that tends to be pretty important. Doesn't get much more serious than that. But not every claim is life or death. So yeah, it seems like the most important ones for us is identifiable harm. As I said in the introduction, I think it could be harm to life or health. It could be harm to democracy, harm to finances, harm to reputation. And part of that also is how widespread is the claim. Again, there's a difference between a senior politician making a claim which is misleading, which everyone's going to be seeing it and talking about it, versus some obscure Facebook group, which frankly no one's on. Perhaps it matters less, even if the claim itself is more outrageous. And there's a big issue there that a lot of misinformation is known to come from the top. It doesn't bubble up from obscure Facebook groups. It does come down from senior politicians and other public figures, as we know far too clearly in the last few years on both sides of the pond. And so, yeah, what is important is a challenge. I think it is always worth checking what important people are saying, meaning our political leaders. They make decisions about that govern our lives. So it's really important we hold them to account to make sure what they say, it really is reliable, as much as we can do that. And so that's where we start anyway.
I mean, maybe another also aspect of importance is talking about different kinds of disinformation, or which could be different media formats or different kinds of campaigns being run. I think we've talked mostly about text today. If we think about images, video, multimedia, what are some of the challenges there, and how does the outlook? What's the outlook?
Yeah, it's probably, as I answer that, it's also worth explaining for Full Fact and other fact-checking organizations how we work with Facebook in particular. So most of what I've been describing really has been looking at, say, political claims and claims of newspapers. We also also involved in the third-party fact-checking scheme, TPFC, which basically is Facebook recognizing they have problems with misinformation on their platform. But rather than try to fix it themselves, which would be very difficult, they basically pay fact-checkers, including Full Fact, to go on and identify claims which are misleading and write a full fact-check article explaining why it's misleading. And then that information can get tagged within the platform. So it's still there, but now there's an overlay saying, warning, this information is unreliable, is linked to the article. If you want to share it, you can still share it, but be aware of that. And the reason I mention that partly is because a lot of those claims we check on Facebook are in fact images and videos. So in the last 8 months or so, with war in Ukraine, we've done quite a lot of checking there of, especially in the early days, of videos coming out of Ukraine, claiming to be from Ukraine, showing military attacks and things. And some of those came from video games, not from the war at all. Some were from Syria 5 years ago. And so it's more a challenge. So it's much harder to automate that kind of analysis. I say I'm harder. It's beyond the work we currently do at Full Fact anyway. So our group's doing that. But basically, trying to identify the source of a video or an image and find out how old it really is. Often it is a starting point. Is just saying, well, if this image is 5 years old, it wasn't taken last week, therefore it's fake. It's misleading. That can be enough to basically be most of a debunk. So finding repeats of it old and repurposed, recaptioned videos and images is a major area there. But not something I can speak much about because it's not my area, I'm afraid.
It's fascinating to hear you say that, beyond publishing fact checks, you'll actually contact, for instance, these people who said something and maybe try to help them make a retraction or correction. To what extent do do you support directly or indirectly counter messaging campaigns? So for instance, and there's some particular story that's trending that's disinformation. If we really want to have the most impact, maybe we want to get the right information out there and try to get that to propagate.
Yeah, it's a difficult one because there's a risk if you jump the gun and you start publishing there's a true information from a fact-checking organization before any misinformation has been spread. You may then actually encourage people to focus on that particular topic, and therefore maybe encourage the misinformation to spread even faster. What we can do, what we often do, especially around expected political events, we plan in advance and start even drafting fact checks, saying, you know, if this person says this, here is the evidence we really want to present. If they say that, here's a different piece of evidence we can present. And so some things can be anticipated at least a bit. We know that, yeah, for example, there's going to be a major finance bill in the UK in about 6 weeks' time, no less than that, 4 weeks' time, and we know that's going to cover, you know, national insurance contributions, energy bills, income tax rates, business tax rates, and so on. And so we can look now and say, what do people said recently about those things? Are they going to repeat those trend promises? Are they going to change those? And therefore we can respond very, very rapidly once a claim has been made in public. If it is wrong, we can say straight away, hopefully within, you know, sometimes within minutes or a few hours at least, here is, you know, a fully fact-checked article. We do most of the checking before the claim is actually made, but we don't tend to publish it before the claim is made, for risk of drawing attention to it.
Yeah, very closely related. I think we think of counter messaging as sort of responsive. Of course, there's this whole other space of work in pre-bunking or inoculation, which is, again, just as you say, you can anticipate the kinds of things because often this is cyclical. The same stories come out again and again. Do we try to get some of those messages out in advance? I think you're saying it's at least outside the scope of what you all are trying to do in terms of actually publishing in advance.
Yeah, I think we tend more to work with other people and sort of suggest to other charities, other journalists, perhaps you should write something about this story before it breaks. To put write an explainer article, make sure Wikipedia's up to date, this kind of stuff. Make sure there are no gaps in public knowledge around that area before it breaks. I'm not sure if we ever do any sort of preemptive debunking directly. We might sometimes do, you know, things to look out for in a future speech, but it's not a major part of our work, certainly.
Another question we got was sort of asking about some of the details about this line between true and untrue. So for instance, you know, when somebody gives a number, how far off do they have to be, right, before we start thinking about this as being incorrect? Or sort of a temporal co-reference. So when I say something about the numbers, maybe tomorrow those aren't the numbers anymore. How do we sort of balance that kind of those kinds of challenges in talking about sort of the line between sort of correct and incorrect?
Yeah, this again where I think all these tools really do need a person in the loop somewhere to make that kind of decision. So in my talk, I quoted an article which had misquoted the inflation figures, and basically they were like 2 weeks out of date when the article was written. And we didn't write a fact check article about that. I don't think we even contacted the journalist and pointed out the error, because we decided, well, the impact's pretty small. You know, it was clearly a mistake. It wasn't a deliberate policy to mislead people. It was just a typo, basically. And so not really worth correcting, even though we know it was wrong. And that's worth stressing in case that isn't clear. We don't try to correct every mistake on the internet. We would be here all day and longer. So yeah, we make a judgment. You know, is it harmful? And so, you know, if it's a rounding error, is it really harmful to people misbelieve to believe they rounded number rather than the true number? It's a matter of judgment. Again, something that the journalists are very good at. For temporal stuff, yeah, I have problems with sometimes when evaluating our stats checker tool, that basically when inflation figures are published, on a certain day each month, in the middle of each month in the UK, it means you need to know what day someone was speaking when they said inflation is now 10%. Was that the day before the figures were released or after the figures were released? If they're talking about, you know, if someone says in September, inflation 10%, and then in October, only then do we find out what inflation really was in September, because these things were published retrospectively. It's easy for the algorithm to think, oh, we now know what September's inflation was, and the person got it wrong. Because actually, when they said that thing, they were talking about the previous figures from the previous month. And so it'd be ridiculous to sort of correct them or even claim the algorithm found an error. So yeah, so I think we have to be aware of temporal challenges. And it also means on a website, we have to be aware if we point out somebody's mistake, and the website, that stays on the website for years. And sometimes the context may shift, and that may no longer be important, may no longer be true. Even for that time, our fact check article was, in good faith saying this is misleading. So yeah, it's a challenge we're aware of there.
Well, we are almost at our time. I will ask maybe one last quick question, and thank you to everyone who submitted questions. Sorry, of course, we didn't have time because there's so many great things to talk about here. So maybe for one last quick question is, people are curious about, again, where are fact checkers spending the most time? If we were going to try to help them speed up one part of the process, which part of it we should focus on to try to accelerate their work?
Yeah, I think finding claims that are important enough to be worth checking will have an impact, and also are checkable. But they can actually, there is a chain of evidence there. There are reports, figures, experts, whatever it is, and therefore the final result will be conclusive. And if you can predict that in a tool fairly reliably, that would save hours every day of accidentally checking the wrong thing, which is always, I think, a risk there. A number of articles will never get published because they don't quite make it to that final draft, and trying to stop those ones earlier on, I think, would be amazing. So yeah, working out whether a claim is not just true or false, that can be quite hard, but is it checkable? Is it likely to be checkable within a reasonable space of time? Is the evidence likely to be there? That kind of area, I think, is a big area for development.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a brilliant keynote. Amazing start to our day.